This is a very important topic. When I was selected to be the judge of the court on this topic of REDD, I accepted that responsibility. I listened to the interventions of this market phenomenon and a so-called solution to the climate crisis that the world is experiencing. This is called REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Thank you to the presenter of this case that laid the context of how REDD violates the rights as explained in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. Thank you to the experts for their expertise on this complex topic that begins to break the boundaries of how we understand the destructive effects and complex interactions of neoliberal capitalism, governance, the legal and political regimes of property rights, human rights, indigenous people's rights, and nature. As a judge of this court, I would like to say a few words about our indigenous cosmology related to our relationship with nature, and my articulation of our relationship with our mother, our grandmother, the earth. This regards my summary and my recommendation to this tribunal on the deliberation of REDD. Working for the environmental and economic justice is spiritual work that reaffirms our human relationship and responsibility to protect the sacredness of Mother Earth, of nature, and the recognition of the indigenous concepts of father sky. Within this way of life, we have natural laws of nature that have been developed since the beginning of time that allows us, as indigenous peoples, as cultured peoples, to live in harmony within the sacredness of creation. These natural laws of Mother Earth and the territorial integrity of Mother Earth are being violated by REDD. Indigenous peoples and people of the land of the world, such as the small farmers and the peasants, participating in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COP meetings, in these climate negotiations, and even other UN meetings, are in the front lines of a foreign power structure that minimizes the importance of indigenous cosmologies and worldviews and land-based and fisher culture communities. These power structures that are going on way over there at this military complex, they reside within the UN process, within the World Bank and financial institutions, and by government systems that have economic systems that objectify, commodify, and put a monetary value on land, water, forests, and air that is contrary to indigenous worldview. Indigenous peoples, north and south, are forced into the world market systems with nothing to negotiate with except the natural resources that we rely on for survival. History has seen attempts to commodify land, food, labor, forests, water, our genes, and ideas such as the privatization of our traditional knowledge. REDD and related regimes such as carbon trading and carbon offsets follow in the footsteps of this history that turns the functions of the forest and the sacredness of our Mother Earth's carbon cycling capacity into property to be bought and sold in the global market. This means any provisions of title to property by modern government legal regimes carries with it the legal authority to destroy the natural communities, which includes human communities and ecosystems that depend on that property for survival. Through this process of creating a new commodity, carbon, Mother Earth's ability and capacity to support a climate conducive to life and human societies is now passing into the same corporate hands that are destroying the climate. I have heard testimony today that REDD and these carbon markets will not contribute to achieving protection of the Earth's climate. It is a false solution which entrenches and magnifies social inequities in many ways. I heard testimony that REDD is a pillar of the so-called green economy that places a monetary price on nature and creates a new derivative market regime that only increases inequality and increases the destruction of Mother Earth and nature. In my understanding, any promotion of REDD and market solutions to mitigate climate change is to put the future of nature and humanity in the hands of financial speculative mechanisms. This includes other market systems of conservation and biodiversity offsets, and payment for environmental and ecological services. Mr. President, judges, prosecutor, and the participants of this tribunal, here are my conclusions. The presentations of this tribunal have demonstrated that REDD projects are a nature-destructive model that claims it is protecting forests. However, testimony based upon research has shown that it is actually a capitalist financial mechanism set up to benefit financial institutions, including the World Bank, conservation and environmental NGOs, governments, and the fossil fuel industry. My analysis is this. It is at the expense of the rights to Mother Earth, the expense of nature, and the expense of the human rights of communities and peoples. I submit to this tribunal to reject REDD. REDD projects inherently violate the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth in the following areas. In my analysis, the rights of nature of Mother Earth are inherent. Nature's rights already exist, and any human law that denies those fundamental rights is illegitimate. Article 1 of the 2010 Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, paragraph 6 says, just as human beings have human rights, all other beings also have rights which are specific to their species, are kind and appropriate for their role and function within the community within which they exist. REDD projects restrict movement and use of forested areas. REDD projects have and are causing the forced eviction of local communities. The presentation of the case of the Sinkwar indigenous tribal peoples experiencing massive evictions and forced eviction in Kenya is an example of this. This is one of the remaining hunter-gatherers of the world being removed from their ancestral home. This is outrageous, and this has to stop. When these governmental REDD restrictions are applied through these REDD projects, this violates the role and function within the communities within which they exist. In other words, the role and function of the area becomes regulated to a simple equation, an offset, which is neither the role nor function of the ecosystem. Further, indigenous peoples have ways of communicating with the living and non-living beings in the regions. We have our own way as indigenous peoples of recognizing the natural laws and the voices of creation. Article 2 of paragraph 1 of the Rights of Mother Earth says that Mother Earth and all beings in which she is composed have the following inherent rights. B, the right to maintain its identity and integrity as a distinct, self-regulating, and interrelated being. As indigenous peoples in the testimonies today and local communities, they clearly talk about the inseparable relationship between humans and the earth, that reciprocal relationship that is very spiritual and very sacred, that inherent
relationship between indigenous peoples and other land-based cultures of the world must be respected for the sake of our future generations and all of humanity. Just as historically the doctrine of discovery was used to justify the first wave of colonialism by alleging that indigenous peoples did not have souls and that our territories were terra nullius, land of nobody. Now carbon trading and REDD are inventing similarly dishonest premises to justify this new wave of colonization and privatization of nature. Mother Earth and her creation of all life, of nature and biodiversity is a source of life which needs to be protected, of rights, not a resource to be exploited and commodified as a natural capital. Herman Daly, the father of ecological economics, once said, "There is something fundamentally wrong in treating the earth as if it were a business in liquidation." The carbon stored in nature, in the air, in the atmosphere, and the photosynthesis processes of the forest make up a part of those beings which have rights. The carbon in the trees have a right to not be used as a commodity. The commodification is a twisted form of financializing something that cannot be monetized. This tribunal will commission a process for continued study and presentation to the next tribunal being proposed to be held in Paris 2015. REDD has been described by the presenters in this tribunal as a pillar of the green economy and a pillar of the financialization of nature. REDD requires this tribunal to examine the link of capitalism with its legal regimes of property rights, its roots based upon the principles of dominion, its application based upon the neoliberalization of nature and privatization of nature. It is a global phenomenon being forced upon communities, as you heard today, throughout the world. REDD is a crime against humanity and Mother Earth. I recommend to this tribunal to recognize the reality of criminalization and threats of harm that is being experienced by local community members who resist REDD, who try to seek credible information on all the risks of REDD, and who only try to recognize the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, called FPIC. FPIC also reserves the right of communities to say no to REDD. I call upon this tribunal, when required, to have resources that will ensure the human rights of presenters to be protected, who are only exercising their free right to speak. For any governmental reprisals of witnesses coming forward to this tribunal will communicate to the United Nations Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and other relevant UN and international human rights instruments and mechanisms to take appropriate action. REDD has many implications on our duties and responsibilities. Our duties and responsibilities as humanity to recognize the creative and life cycles of Mother Earth, of her nature, and of Father Sky. Scheduling and organizing regional tribunals on REDD and carbon markets in Latin America and Africa have been talked about in the hallways of this tribunal. This tribunal must support the planning of these regional tribunals that can bring their articulation and recommendations to Paris in 2015. Thank you.